Hello and welcome to the 2021 BFI London Film Festival Industry Events Programme. My name is Alex Rittman. I'm the UK correspondent for The Hollywood Reporter, and I'm here to moderate what I hope will be a very interesting panel about the wonderful world of podcasts and their role in the film and television industry. We are joined in this discussion today by Steve Ackerman, who's the Executive Vice President and Co-Head of Global Podcasts at Sony, having joined this summer following Sony's acquisition of producer Something Else. Rob Herting, CEO of QCODE, a podcast studio network that launched in 2019, but which early this year teamed with Apple Plus for the subscription service QCODE Plus. Nigel Eaton, who in July left Apple, where she was head of content for Apple Podcasts, and moved to Netflix to become its first head of podcasts. And Ruth Fitzsimons, managing director of Podfront, a joint venture between Stitcher and Wondery, two of the world's biggest podcast companies. Now, as everyone knows, the podcast industry has been absolutely booming over the last few years, with seemingly every man, woman and child deciding to launch their own podcast. But it's only recently that we've seen this huge interest from the film and TV world. So it'd be great if we could explore this and see why, studios and streamers are trying to get in on the act. So I suppose, Nigeri, as Netflix's first head of podcasts, over to you. Can you explain why this sudden interest from the film and TV world?
Yeah, I think there's been such a huge growth in podcasts and interest in podcasts because it's IP, right? That's the big thing. I think of like Hollywood sort of like, I don't know, hungry hippos, right? And podcasts are like the little balls of IP that everyone's trying to go after because that's what fuels new content, new film, new TV series, new interests. So that's, I think, a huge factor, but also it's another way to engage with your audience about something that they're really excited about, whether they want to learn more about their show that they're consuming, or they want to learn behind the scenes, or just want to learn more about the cast, or dive into a fictional world that's a part of a title. It's just it opens up so many opportunities.
Interesting. And Steve, what's having joined Sony recently, what was their viewpoint? Why have they come into this game, and what are they looking for from you?
Well, I think the main reason Sony are in the game is because obviously it's the newest creative space, and we're part of Sony Music, which is the bit of Sony that's been charged with leading Sony's push into podcasting, and obviously it's a massively creative business, and podcasting is quickly proving to be a key part of the creative industries. I think if you're looking at sort of an area where you can tell stories and really engage audiences, and where obviously you can start to develop an audience around listening, then it starts to become sort of fairly clear why podcasting is attractive.
And if we look at sort of the actual value of podcasts, how do you ascertain their worth? Ruth, you've look after a company that produces a lot of podcasts. So how do you view the value?
I think it's really interesting that we kind of divide up, how we approach podcasting, because, we work with Stitcher and Wondery. So two of the world's biggest podcasting companies. For Wondery, they look at it in very much the kind of realm of IP. So a lot of the incredible shows that they make start off as podcasts and end up as TV shows. So you just have to look at the success of something like Dr. Death, which was a hugely successful podcast that kind of chronicled this incredible true crime story about a neurosurgeon who, I won't give away the end, but had a number of malpractice suits against him. And it's really kind of lots of twists and turns in that story. And if you've ever listened to it, it really has you on edge, in an audio space. But really recently, that's actually been made into a TV 8-part series with Joshua Jackson and Alec Baldwin and also Christian Slater. And so, that's a really great example of where something has started off as a podcast, been successful as a podcast commercially as well, but then also transferred into the kind of TV space. And, that was picked up by Peacock in the US. It'll be picked up here by Starz. And that's a really interesting model, this kind of using podcasting as a space to not just build an audience, but also to experiment creatively with kind of concepts and themes that's one way of approaching it. The other way is we look at someone like our other parent company, which is Stitcher. And so Stitcher have been in the space for, gosh, around over 10 years. And they work with Oprah. They work with, kind of anyone who's anyone really, Mark Maron, Oprah, Seth Rogen's just about to launch a podcast with them. But their model is also slightly different. So they've worked with a number of very famous celebrities, such as the team behind The Office. So in that case, that's a companion style show. It's quite nostalgic, actually, because The Office is finished, so it's not really companion. Mm-hmm. But that is Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsley, who were Pam and Angela from the show. And they essentially are rewatching the whole of The Office. But that show is hugely successful, like millions of listens. And that's a big commercial success when it comes to selling advertising around it. But equally, it re-engages audiences back with that show as well, because they're going to go back and listen to the show. So I think value comes in a number of different ways, depending on really what you're looking for podcasts to do for your brand. Interesting.
And Rob, how do you feel the value of podcasts? You've obviously worked in podcasts for a while, but now joining with Apple Plus, has that changed the approach? What are they looking for when they work with you?
Yeah, I would say, agree with what everyone said. I think the value of podcasts are, they can serve as a creative way into a story. I think what's been exciting, we've had many shows that have gone on and are in development for film and television. And so the exploration creatively in terms of the storytelling, I think is obvious. I would say from a value perspective, what might separate podcasts from other forms of IP is how frictionless and available they are to listeners and to consumers. And I think that is really powerful, and why they've caught on recently and continue to ascend and become more popular. And I think entertainment creatives, it's easy to pop on wherever you find podcasts, listen to them, and get those stories. And that's really powerful. And I don't know that the same can necessarily be said for there's no disrespect to books or comic books or all other forms of IP. I just think that the limited friction available to listeners has created this value, and that's an audience. That's also as the audience has come into this space. Now there's a large element of discovery, and I think that's powering some of these new and original stories. So yeah.
And when it comes to the revenue models, a lot of the time you're even looking to sort of generate income from the podcasts. I appreciate, Ruth, a lot of what you do is to do with generating advertising. But from the others among you, are you there to try and make any profit? So Steve, the podcast that you make with Sony, are they, is this to drive revenue, or is it something entirely different?
No, it's absolutely about revenue, but I think it's very much with a sophisticated view of the market in terms of having a long-term approach. This is a massively growing area, and I think anybody who wants to be in podcasting in the long term has got to be patient as well. But absolutely, revenue is key, and obviously we are aiming to sort of make money, and really there's three key revenue streams for us. You've touched on them really, which is ad revenue, subscription revenue, and obviously derivative revenue. So those are the three key areas. It doesn't necessarily mean every show is going to tick all three of those boxes, but those are the areas we're concentrating on. And yeah, absolutely, we want to make money, but we want to make brilliant shows as well.
And Nigel, how do you view it at Netflix? What's the goal there? Is it to draw people into the service, or is it to add an extra bonus for those who are there? What's the how do you view the podcast you have on the platform?
Yeah, the goal is really to have another place to engage with passionate Netflix fans of our content, passionate audiences. We don't have any advertising on our podcast, so the goal is to just keep a buzz and people talking about our content, or talking about our audiences talking to each other. Strong Black Lead is a sub brand of ours that speaks to content created by and for Black people and people of the Black diaspora. And so we have a podcast like Okay Now Listen, which isn't specifically about Netflix content, right? But it's about really growing the conversation and our reach around that particular audience. So there's a lot of different reasons why we do them, but it's not necessarily to monetize, but to really just keep the conversation going around Netflix and the content. And hopefully, also then people continue to consume content on the service.
And where do, I mean, it seems like there's a broad range of answers to this, and you've answered them already, but where do podcasts fit in the ecosystem? Are they marketing tools, development tools? Which is more important or valuable to you?
I think they're great as marketing tools. We actually have a great collaboration with something else on the Crown, the official podcast, right? So it helps to each season is timed the next season of the Crown. It helps to, of course, market the show, but provide a deeper level of engagement for people who watch the show to learn about the costumes, the history behind some of these stories. And so it's really twofold. And I think there's a lot of different reasons why we create our podcast. We don't necessarily have, we're not necessarily launching podcasts that are original content that aren't tied to specific audience as of now, but it's also a way for us to do some world building. So recently we launched in June a podcast called Rebel Robin, Surviving Hawkins, which is a fictional podcast about Robin, a character from the last season of Stranger Things. It's a completely original story, but really it's about extending the world of Stranger Things, which is a beloved show. So that's kind of how we've been approaching podcasting so far.
And I think it's a really interesting, just to jump in, I think it is really interesting that in terms of expanding into that audio space, because one thing that people should know is that about 80 to 90% of podcast listeners have pay for subscription TV services. So they are, generally speaking, not necessarily getting the same advertising as someone who's on kind of a free to view TV model. And so for other TV networks, especially, it's an opportunity to reach them because, one of the issues can be is that it's very hard for you to advertise on a rival TV network. So, this is a space which you can create and you can get people to, because of the way podcasts are consumed, they can subscribe and listen, and either they can subscribe and listen to maybe their favorite show, maybe it's The Crown and they can really get into it, or in the case of maybe another show where marketeers are using it as a marketing tool to reach those, they're subscribing to their favorite podcast, be it Office Ladies, be it, Dr. Death or Business Wars or whatever it might be. And they're hearing an ad for the upcoming film or TV series in an audio space. So, you're being able to reach those audiences as well. So it is really interesting how we're able to get into an audience that otherwise is going to be in these kind of almost siloed TV subscription services.
Are we now, you're talking about the Crown podcast, are we now kind of reaching a point where it's the norm for these big shows to have a companion podcast? And, is it important for shows producers to start thinking of this, from the off? Rob, you're obviously working with Apple Plus on with their shows. So is that exactly what they're looking for? Do they need a companion podcast for each one of their shows that they're launching?
I think it's a big part of what's happening in film and TV. To your point, I think it's an opportunity for all media and entertainment companies that are making film and television to market the show and also to give additional kind of shoulder content to fans to keep them further engaged. So, I can't speak directly to it because it isn't as much of what we've done at QCODE, but I would say I see it all the time. I think it's growing. HBO, I think, is a company that's doing a lot of that really well right now, amongst many others. So I suspect it will only grow. I think if you talk to fans, it's one of the areas that's most consumed and I think enjoyed by listeners. they're spending tons of hours streaming these shows, and they just want more, right? And that's now available in podcasts.
And do we think it's important for, obviously there's lots of fan created podcasts, but is it increasingly important for the producers to kind of own the official podcast to a show? Is that something that we're seeing more and more of?
I think I do think that's important. I mean, we've talked about The Crown, and we've got the new James Bond podcast out at the moment as well. And I think what you're seeing with producers who really understand the space, film and TV producers who really understand the space. The beauty of podcasting is you've got a super engaged audience. Obviously, it's a lean-in experience. People are listening, they're wearing headphones. It's a very intimate experience, and they're paying attention to what they hear. And so, as a marketing opportunity, it's phenomenal. Now, I don't think that necessarily rules out the sort of fan-led shows that might happen, and things like The Office show are sort of great examples of that. But I don't think you would plan a billboard campaign and just ask other people to draw pictures for you and expect to have a good marketing campaign there. So why would you take the same approach in the audio space? It's not an expensive space compared to many other mediums. You can create fantastic shows that really can engage audiences. And so it is interesting that more and more we're seeing this. And I think the other thing we're really seeing is, again, for those who understand the space, and obviously Netflix are definitely in that box. You see film and TV producers moving away from just the standard sort of EPK kit where they're sort of handing out some sort of stock interviews and try and make a show out of that. They're actually making the stars of the show or people behind the scenes accessible. I mean, what we do with Netflix over The Crown is incredible in terms of the access they give us to the entire team behind the scenes, in front of the camera, so that we can really bring fans something that's sort of truly original and sort of special. And that obviously just builds upon the value that they just have for that show then, and the love and passion that they have for that show.
But I think just one other thing, which is you don't have to pick one or the other, right? Because so one of the things that's really important to kind of realize is you might own the companion piece to your show. So you might have commissioned a companion piece, but often, you need to promote that companion piece as well. That's also kind of part of this space. And you may also want to promote the show at the same time as you have a companion piece. And you can do both in the podcast space. As Steve said, it's a relatively affordable space to do the kind of marketing spends around that. And so where you can reach those audiences. We recently worked with actually Netflix on one of their UK originals where we kind of teamed up with, it was for The Ripper, and we teamed up with a number of kind of true crime podcasts, from My Favorite Murder to some of the others, who have incredible reach, really incredible reach with really dedicated fans. They know what their fans like. They know what their audience likes. And so, kind of we're teaming up kind of similar content, and it feels very authentic, and it feels like a very personalized recommendation, because in the podcast space, those are generally delivered using host reads. So that's the host talking about the show themselves, rather than a pre-produced spot ad campaign that you might hear on the radio. So it feels much more like a recommendation from a trusted friend who you listen to every single week. So again, it doesn't have to be one or the other. There's kind of a multitude of layers to really getting your message across, both in terms of reach, and then for those dedicated fans who you can hook in with the original companion piece. And kind of, I think both of those used together, I think, are incredibly effective. And
Nigel, at Netflix, you obviously Netflix releases a lot of shows. Every week, there's rather a lot that come out, film, TV. What sort of conversations do you have about which ones you should do podcasts for? Which we should do podcast spin-offs? I mean, does everybody want a podcast for their show, and how do you pick and choose which ones should get one?
Yeah, I should preface this by saying I am 2 months into this job, right? So there's lots of conversations I have yet to have, and lots of conversations that were had in the past that I was not party to, right? And I'm really excited about conversations moving forward. But I will say, it's, Netflix is a massive place, but just like any other place I worked at, whether it's Apple or NPR, everyone is really either excited about podcasts and when they hit the ground running, or they're like, oh, podcasts, that seems to be a thing, right? So it's like kind of one of those two things. And so my job is to really help everyone figure out, and really work in collaboration with different teams and titles and shows and departments to think about, where are the bets we should be placing in podcasts? Where does it make sense to lean into versus things that maybe we try a different approach, right? Which is whether like it's partnering with other podcasts, existing podcast audiences, or doing ads to promote the show. So there's lots of very different approaches we can take, and so my job is to kind of help sort through all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And Steve, you touched on this a minute ago, but the cost of podcasts. I mean, are they? You say you're trying to make the podcast kind of, sing and dance and get, the great access, but are they still cheap to make? Is it still somebody sat in a kitchen with a microphone recording it, or have they gone up as the quality of the podcast gone up and that sort of pushed costs up with it?
Well, there are people sitting in kitchens with microphones, but we're definitely not one of them. So, QCODE are definitely not either. I think, at the top end of the market, we're talking about serious production now and serious production standards. And certainly for companies like us and QCODE and others, we're bringing high levels of production. When I say it's cheap, all I mean is it's cheap compared to obviously film or TV, for the obvious reason that you have a lot less people involved, and the turnaround times are a lot quicker, and obviously it's a lot more flexible. I mean, clearly in the middle of a global pandemic, it is much easier to be recording remotely and still doing that in a quality way than it is with obviously filming or TV, which throws up so many other problems. So yeah, compared to those other mediums, it is cheap, but I think if you're going to do something properly, you're really looking at a six-figure budget, I think, to ensure it's done well for a companion type show.
Good. I didn't mean to be disparaging about people in kitchens. I know it's much bigger than that. For those who are watching this, who are kind of maybe sort of budding creatives in the film and TV world, and seeing podcasts as another opportunity to kind of help themselves get up the ladder, what do you have any kind of advice about how they can use podcasts to their advantage? I'm not sure who's best placed to speak here. Maybe Rob.
Yeah, I'll take that. Look, I think that it is the most exciting space for creators. Steve just touched on the time. Look, I prior to this, I was an agent for many years, worked with a lot of writers and directors, and there is obviously a path to getting movies and TV shows made. It can oftentimes be long and circuitous, and it requires many steps. Not to say that that there aren't some of those in podcasts, but there are costs, but they're much lower, as Steve was just mentioning, and there is a DIY piece of it where I think creators can go out and make something bold and distinctive and put it out to the world and try and connect with. There are so many companies now in the space that are working with new creatives. So I think you can find a partner, you can go out and actually do it, and there is an opportunity to really break through. So I think it's exciting. I think we're going to see more and more of that, discovery element of new artists breaking through. And I'm really excited about it. So as far as advice is just go do, and you'll learn along the way. And I think because the budgets can be so much lower, that opportunity is very real.
I also think you're starting to see podcasting turn a little bit more into kind of almost like the TV and film situation, where you have a great idea and you go and you find a podcast network that it chimes with, and then you're often teaming up with them and they're helping to co-fund it, and they're helping to put in the marketing spend behind it. They're maybe allocating some of the production resource as well. So, I would say that actually, I really think that people who work in TV and film are incredibly well placed in some ways to come into the space, because I think that ability to kind of tell a story, that kind of narrative arc, works really well in the podcasting space. And, there's a lot of people who are experimenting at the moment with kind of various different types of podcasts. So while we saw a lot of kind of maybe true crime podcasts a couple of years ago, we're now starting to see podcasts that are in very different spaces, be those, kind of wellness, or Seth Rogen's new podcast is really about someone telling him a story and then creating this kind of world through audio production off the back of it, so kind of a bit more surrealist. So it is really interesting where you can go and kind of where some of those kind of creative ideas can go. But as Rob said, in some ways, kind of getting up and kind of going around knocking on those doors is probably the most important.
And do you think, I mean, do you have to be like a known name? Do you have to have a following online? I mean, so many of these podcasts are celebrity driven. You mentioned Seth Rogen, but can somebody who's just got a great idea knock on a door and, you know, get the ball rolling?
Like, I think they can, but I think like everything, in the same way you would approach any kind of production, you do want to have a really good story and you want to have kind of like the ability to tell that story really well. I do think it is helpful sometimes to team up with someone from an audio background, though. And I would say that, you know, kind of having come from an audio background myself, you know, I think there is a different way of telling stories on film and in audio. There's a different way of thinking about the structure, thinking about the sound, thinking about some of the ways of kind of pitching and getting over that. But I think that's possible to find, you know, kind of to have your fantastic idea. You don't necessarily need to be just a celebrity. A number of the podcasters we now talk about and that are huge were not celebrities necessarily when they first started out. They've kind of grown, and some of those have kind of changed who they are and their size. But I do think that's where they've often partnered, especially in the last few years when more and more podcasts have come into the space. They've partnered with bigger networks who've been able to kind of leverage their size and scale to give them the kind of cross promotion needed to push them into the charts, to push them in front of other people. Because, you know, as of 2021, I think there's 2 million podcasts out there in the world. So it's, to get heard is, you know, that's the difficult part.
And sorry, Nigel.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I do think it also depends on who you're looking to work with, right? There are some companies that do actually care about celebrity, they care about the reach you have already. There's some companies, right, that will take a chance on someone who has, you have to have a really great singular idea if you've never worked in this space before. I think oftentimes people also who've never worked in audio really vastly underestimate the work it takes to make a great podcast. So that's why, again, partnering with someone who has that experience, or a company that has that experience, is so important. And I think I would just say, as creators who are looking to start out, is the podcast community is an incredibly giving community. I think there's so many great spaces, whether it's on Clubhouse or podcast movement or different like Slack channels and radio lists, where people like are happy to kind of share advice and learnings, and to really like take advantage of that that openness that this community has to help kind of guide you. I think that's really key, and that's, I think, also kind of unique to this industry.
Nice. Do you think we reached the point, sort of like the book industry, where, you know, there's such a growing demand for the rights to great stories that that podcasts are being sought after sort of long before they've actually launched? You know, is there a market for podcasts yet, or is that some way off?
I think Rob has a great answer to that.
I'll say I think there is a market. Absolutely. I think you know, and I think that all of the film and television companies are looking aggressively towards the podcast space. You know, as far as pre-selling something, I think it's certainly possible, and I think it's actually happening. I off the top of my head, I can't think of one. You know, I might make the argument that it's probably better to let the podcast come out and then bring it to market. But I certainly think that's a possibility. I think that cross collaborations between existing film and TV companies and podcasters ahead of the launch to maybe partner around a piece of IP so that they can both have a hand in the launch of it. I think we're going to see a lot more of that to come. And I'm also excited to see Tribeca and hopefully Sundance, some of the festivals that worked in film and television and continue to exist, not just domestically, but internationally as well, really start to showcase new work. And I think that may help create further, as you said, like a market for these shows. And I think, more specifically might really help some of the discovery and to what you were saying earlier, Alex, about people, new creatives entering the space, give an opportunity to some of those voices to to find some of these partners and sell their IP.
Interesting. I mean, you mentioned festivals. It's not something I considered, but how much are they embracing the podcast world? I mean, they're only just getting over TV, you know.
I think they are. I think that the festivals are all intrigued by it. I can't speak to all of them, but I know that I think every festival is exploring podcasts, looking to host panels, develop podcast programs. So I just think like everything, it's so new, and so it's going to take a little bit of time to grow, but fast forward a few years, and I think you're going to see a lot more of that, which will be great for everyone.
Fantastic. And obviously, we've seen this huge growth in podcasts over the last year and a half. But how much, 2 years? But how much do you think the global pandemic has really kind of lent itself to this growth? Steve, perhaps.
Well, it's definitely helped. It's given it a push because obviously people have been at home, they have more time to fill, and so we've seen discovery of podcasts has gone up. But the truth is, podcasting was well on its way in terms of the aggressive growth of the audience, and it continues to do that. And the projections that I'm sure everybody here, in their individual companies are seeing, are all pointing to the same picture, which is a sector that is growing at a terrific rate, not just in the already fairly established markets of the UK and the US, though they still have a long way to go, and sort of potential growth, but also in lots of other newer markets around the world as well. So it is a super exciting space. And sort of one other thing I'd say that sort of just maybe draws back to the previous point as well, that if you want to know if there's a market, the fact you've got folks like UTA and CA and WME all over this space is kind of all you need to know about, is there a market or not?
Sure. Everyone agree with that?
Yeah, I think, we've seen bigger and bigger stars come into the space in the last year. You just start to see these, Smartless is a good example of that. Do you know what I mean? You have just really A-list celebrities kind of coming on board to do a podcast. I just don't think that that's something that we would have seen, kind of John Bateman and, kind of various people coming on board to do those things, or Oprah, a couple of years ago. But there's now the space, and they kind of recognize that there's a lot more flexibility in what they can do, especially during the pandemic. That was the one thing that was incredible, is a lot of shows continued during the pandemic, and they were kind of there. And we also saw new genres come out of the pandemic, so far more wellness shows, for example. Jay Shetty, he launched his own podcast, and those did incredibly well because they connected with audiences who, it hasn't exactly been the easiest year and a half, let's be honest. And they connected with those audiences really well. And that's the thing about podcasting, is you don't have to wait for a very long commissioning process and filming processes. It can respond to the zeitgeist quite quickly.
I was just going to add, I think it hopefully ushered in a lot of innovation. I know for us it did. We were in production on 2 shows right when the pandemic hit full swing. Dirty Diana with Demi Moore and Hank the Cowdog with Matthew McConaughey, both fictional series that we were producing. And on the fly, had to figure out fully kind of remote setups for all of these people. And I think, they're all of a sudden recording in their homes. And I know we're not alone. I think everyone was going through that together. And speaking from our experience, a lot of those processes we carry forward now, in some hybrid at the moment, but I think going forward, a lot of people will use that. And again, it really gives podcasting an advantage because of that kind of flexibility that I think it can afford really everyone involved. So just wanted to add that.
So if I remember correctly, sorry, if I remember correctly, there's a sort of viral moment with Demi taking a picture of herself recording the show from her bathroom with carpet, and everyone was like, what is going on?
Yeah. Not in the
pandemic.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that she not planned, was in her bathroom, and she has a pretty fun bathroom, and went viral. So one of those unintended funny moments that happened.
I can imagine.
We had a pretty similar thing with David Tennant, where I mean, a bathroom sounds luxurious because he was doing it from a cupboard, from a closet, literally with a duvet hung up for the soundproofing. And actually, if you listen to the episodes, he sounds fantastic. I mean, he really does. But he was in his little cupboard on his second floor of his house or something.
Yeah. And if I could just add about the remote nature of this and the pandemic, what the pandemic has brought is that it's meant that everyone's had to figure out how to do this remotely, right? But it's also meant so much opportunity, I think, for people that may not have had opportunity before because they don't live in New York or LA or London. And so be able to like record remotely from everywhere, I think really helped to write so many opportunities to new producers, really helps to kind of diversify the base of production teams. And still, when I see jobs being posted in different, newsletters, by and large, it's like remote. We're looking for remote people, and so I think that's just huge for this industry, and really exciting.
Nice. I was going to say, I imagine would have thought the acoustics in Demi's bathroom weren't up to it, but then she's probably got a lot bigger bathroom than most people.
Yeah.
I think I've only got time for one more question, so I'm going to ask you all if a bit of a cheesy one, but what is your current favorite podcast? And you're not allowed to name one of your own. So I'll start with Steve.
I'm going to name, well, it's not really one of my own, but it is a Sony one, which is Bad Blood, which is following the Theranos case, but it's from John Carreyrou, who's the actual journalist who first broke the story in the Wall Street Journal 6-7 years ago. So it's a really fantastic listen. Fantastic.
Ruth?
Oh gosh, you put me on the spot there. Now I'm trying to think about what podcasts I've been listening to. There's a couple of different ones that I really enjoyed. I did actually hear one, Hip Hop Saved My Life, with Ramesh Ranganathan, which I've always really enjoyed. And it's just a really kind of fun and joyous one. But I've also been listening to Dr. Death Season 3, which has got me on the edge of my seat again. So yeah, I think alternating between those will take down my blood pressure from time to time.
Okay, good. Nigeri?
So I've listened to South Lake, which is from, I believe, NBC News, which kind of explains what's been happening here in the US of like people being just super, lots of protests around teaching critical race theories in high schools, which does not actually happen, and kind of like, how did that come to be, this conversation? I look at this one small town in Texas. So I really like that, but also I really love what Pineapple Street has been doing with their series 11th, which is like monthly, and it's long form episodes that don't need a whole nother podcast series. But I've been listening to the episodes about the making of The Score by Fugees, and what was like when it came out in 1996, and it's very great, very soothing for this geriatric millennial to listen to.
I'm totally going to steal that and listen.
Yeah.
Rob?
Two. One, and I think credit here to Nigeri, because this was one of yours, but the line, the Apple original that you guys did, I just finished and really loved. And then the other one for me, Guy Raz's How I Built This is a constant favorite of mine that I enjoy. So those would be my two.
Fantastic. Excellent answers. Well, guys, thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for, but great to speak to you and hear about the ongoing rise of podcasts and the increased interest of the film and TV world. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.